So the idea of this little girl who sees herself as a time being, and who as a person with a very limited lifespan, because she's going to commit suicide. This kind of took hold of my imagination, and she started writing. She started sort of writing to the world, and that was the first, I think, the genesis of the project. It's always hard to sort of pinpoint where a novel starts, and I think this one started. I started thinking about it in probably about 2001, 2002, and after 9/11, during the period when America was sort of ramping up to war, and I was very aware of. Well, I think it was particularly the way President Bush was talking. He had this kind of belligerent, sort of bullying tone in his voice all the time, and I started thinking about the sort of bully culture that we live in. That we have. We have governments, we have corporations, we have these power structures that are essentially bullying power structures. And at that same time, I was reading a lot of newspapers from Japan talking about the problems with teen suicides and bullying in the schools. And there were some horrific examples that I read about. And so I think all of that was kind of at the back of my mind. And the character of Now sort of arose from that. I think that she came from she was a voice of a little girl who was in a situation of being bullied. I mean, suicide runs through the book. I had never realized this before, but a lot of the kamikaze fighters were college students. They were really some of the most intelligent, the creme de la creme of Japanese youth, and they were not particularly right-wing, militaristic, boys at all. They were scholars, and they were philosophers, and they were poets, and they were beautiful writers, and they kept these diaries that were absolutely heartbreaking. Knowing that there was no way that they could escape conscription, because if their families would suffer sort of terrible retribution if they refused to go, and then they couldn't refuse to go. I mean, they had to go, and knowing that they were going to then be, and because they were so bright, they were easy to train, right? And so they were trained for these suicide missions, and they knew that it was certain death. There was no way to escape this. So they were looking into the face of their own death, and they had these brilliant minds. And so they talked about their experiences in ways that were just heartbreaking. And it was such a waste. And you read these diaries, and you're just aware that this is such a waste. And so I was reading that, and I remember just wanting to use this material, to share this material. I wanted people to know about this, and so that was, certainly at the part of, at the back of my mind during the first part of the decade, and then I started hearing about these young high school students and junior high school students in Japan who were also committing suicide. And then, of course, when the Japanese economic bubble burst, there was a kind of increase in the number of middle-aged men, businessmen in Japan, who had been laid off, who were also committing suicide. And so there was this kind of, sudden surge in the numbers of suicides, coming from Japan. And of course that was, incredibly disturbing to read about. Nao's best friend is her 104-year-old great-grandmother, right, who's a Zen Buddhist nun. And at least we think she's 104 years old. It's hard to tell because nobody, people have stopped counting. And Nao is very aware that she's going to die soon. And Nao is a little girl who really needs help. And I think that her great-grandmother teaches her how to sit in meditation, teaches her how to sit zazen, and by doing so, teaches her how to sort of maintain her groundedness and her sense of self, even while she's being bullied, even while the things in her life are conspiring to really sort of knock her off her center. And that's the sort of self-reliance that now I think that that saves her life in the end. And I think that was something that I found in my own life too. I mean, I started seriously practicing Zen Buddhism around that same time. I'd been practicing in a Tibetan tradition before that, but and I'd been sitting in meditation for quite some years. But I started really seriously studying Zen around 2000, 2001. And that's when, and I found it very much, very helpful in the same ways. My father died in 1998, and my mother died in 2004. And my mother had Alzheimer's, and so I was caring for her. And that experience of caring for somebody who's very old and very sick, it can be a very destabilizing one. And for me, the practice of sitting Zen and studying Buddhism was really helpful during that time. And so I think, clearly, that experience of mine sort of infused the book, and and I think that was something that now and I were able to share, as both characters in life and in the book. I think one of the things that I've always, been aware of, I'm half Japanese, so I have these, I have a Japanese mother and an American father, and I've always been very aware, because I've traveled back and forth between Japan and the U.S. quite a bit. It's almost like I have the Pacific gyres are something that I almost feel in my body, right? The sense, so the connection between the two continents, is a very physical, sort of very visceral connection, but. It's not just that. I mean, one of the other thing that I just became very aware of, and have been aware of too, is the way that information also sort of spins in these kind of gyre-like, formations. And and so, when I'm on this tiny little island in the middle of Desolation Sound, watching the world. Sort of emerge, watching things emerge in the world. I mean, I'm watching the internet. I'm constantly, sort of watching YouTube, watching all of this, and especially with the tsunami. I mean, the images that were just, sort of pouring in through, through YouTube and through the internet. It was really heartbreaking. It was a horrible and heartbreaking time, and yet there was nothing. There was nothing to do. There was no way to respond to this. I mean, I just felt so, I felt so inundated, with stories and with the images, and in fact, that feeling is one that I think we all have, because we have so much access now to images and to information. We're so aware of the tragedies that are unfolding in the world, and yet there's so little that we can do about it. We watch, we try to respond, but there's such a limit to what we can do, because there's just so much tragedy in the world. And so that was something else that I've been, of course, aware of ever since. I mean, I've been aware of it for a long time, but it seemed to intensify with 9/11. And then, the wars that followed it. And once again, I just, the tsunami and the earthquake were just sort of another of a long series of disasters that I've been watching unfold in the world. And so that seemed to become a very important part of the book as well. So one of the things that really inspired me was something called the I novel, or in Japanese, it's called Shishosetsu, or Watakushi Shosetsu, which is just a direct translation of I novel. And it was a genre that became very popular in the beginning of the early 1900s, during the Meiji period, during the late Meiji period. And it was, I suppose it's an autobiographical novel, where the writer would put himself or put herself in the book, sometimes using the first person, sometimes using the third person, but would be recognizable. Okay, so readers would read the book and understand that this is the novelist writing a kind of a loosely fictionalized version of his life or her life. I think there were more men writing, more men writing at that time period, but more men writing in this genre at that time too. But there were some women who were using it, and it was interesting because, I mean, there are various sort of theories about why this genre became very popular at that particular time. But, you know, I mean, Japan had been a feudal country for 400 years. And so the idea of the individual self, right, was something fairly new at that time. And so the idea that you know, that a writer would sort of step forward and claim an individual identity was and especially for women, you know, was something quite novel and very, you know, very new and very European. And so that's, I think, part of why it was so, you know, these became so popular. And there's been a kind of a parallel between, you know, people have drawn parallels between the iNovel form and also blogging. Right, because, you know, blogging platforms have allowed that same kind of stepping forward and writing in the, you know, writing one's own experience, writing in the first person, sort of claiming, you know, claiming one's life as literature, right, as a suitable subject for literature. And so you see this in you know, weblogs, and there are weblogs that, you know, have compared the iNovel genre to what's happening now. And that always intrigued me as well. So the, you know, in A Tale for the Time Being, the idea of actually putting myself as a character, you know, in the book, you know, I was kind of, you know, referring back to this tradition, this genre of the iNovel in Japan. I remember at the time very much wanting to write a story about a little girl writing a diary and casting it out into the world, and then the diary being found by a reader. And so it would almost be as though the little girl sort of conjured up, wrote a reader into being. Right. So that the very act of writing a diary is what calls a reader forth, okay? And calls the reader into being.